I first began coming to China in early 1989. For 30 years, I've witnessed the country becoming the second largest economy in the world. Once a backward economy and a closed society, China is now engaged openly with every country on earth. This year, 2018, marks 40 years of China's reform and opening up, a historic era of economic dynamism and social development. Looking to the past, what challenges were faced? What obstacles were overcome? Looking to the future, what lessons to learn, what principles to apply? Watch our special series on Closer to China, 40 years and counting. In this 40th year of China's reform and opening up, President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. That's why we titled this series 40 Years and Counting, Transforming Reform and Opening Up for the New Era. What lessons have been learned? What challenges lie ahead? In this episode on governance reform, we explore three topics, each not without sensitivities. Market versus government. What is the optimum balance? Rule of law. How serious is leadership? Role of the party. How does the CPC exercise leadership and governance? Looking back, what were the challenges and outcomes? Looking forward, what are the issues and prospects? Governance reform in China is not, as many foreigners imagine it should be. It is not Western-style democracy. Rather, governance reform here is broad-based, encompassing diverse roles of state institutions, rule of law, greater checks and balances within the inter-party system, public transparency such as in the promotion of officials, and the participation of citizens in the process of governance through multiple forms of access and input, especially online. In some ways, China's early reforms were rather mainstream. The country opened up for trade and foreign investment, liberalized prices, diversified in ownership, and strengthened property rights. But the process was not simple and not easy. Resisting reforms is a universal principle, and in China's case, there was also ideological inertia. Since reform and opening up began, China has conducted 7 large-scale institutional reforms, including a major one in March 2018. What motivated these reforms? What are the objectives? Exploring the role of governance in China's comprehensive development brings us closer to China. Well known as the Hawaii of China, Hainan, the country's southernmost province, will become a new pilot-free trade zone, enjoying higher-level opening up policies. It will accelerate opening up of modern agriculture, high-tech industries, and modern services. Xingzi Ye's business fits well. She decides to expand further.
We can get things done by submitting materials to this reception desk once and for all. We don't need to get ratification from different government departments, such as the Land Resources Department or Urban Planning Department. As the first phase construction of our project has successfully completed, I'm here to submit our plans for the second phase.
Hainan plans to foster a law-based, business-friendly environment. In the past, for example, a construction project would need permissions from various government departments, a laborious, time-consuming process. Now, various types of plans can be integrated into a single master plan, streamlining the approval process.
A project's document for approval will be evaluated by the system first to see whether the land usage stated in the document is in accordance with all aspects of urban planning. After the digital examination, a report will be generated. If the project passes the assessment, it will be shown in green on the system. Otherwise, it will be marked in pink. A project won't be approved if it has not got all items in green. This system also limits the interference of human factors to the evaluation of the project and the implementation of urban planning.
In this government affairs hall, in addition to handling specific projects, the maps, data, and other information from various government departments at all levels are gathered, shared, and analyzed, providing scientific bases for government decisions.
Government departments at all levels can get access to the database, which contains information from other departments. In the past, they only have data collected by themselves. Now, based on abundant data and more comprehensive information, government officials can expand management scope and provide more service to residents.
In addition, some officials' work has to be adjusted. Wu Wei-shu has been working in this government affairs hall for 5 years. In the past, a large part of his work centered on project approval. But as the majority of the process is now digitized, the focus of his work has shifted to supervising ongoing projects.
As the approval process is further simplified, we will pay more attention to site supervision to ensure the projects go smoothly before getting final ratification, which requires certain functions or power only higher authorities possess and is not in line with our original duties. So our department is working on the regulatory list for us to abide by and is coordinating with other authorities to set up a complete supervision system.
The policies and institutional systems needed for a free trade port in Hainan are being constructed stage by stage, step by step. Opening up is more action than words. It involves building a fair, accessible, unified, and efficient market environment, along with the determination to deepen institutional reform. To explore the relationship between economic reform and governance reform, I meet with economists and political theorists. Zhang Bijan, a longtime senior advisor to China's leadership, Justin Yifu Lin, who supports a proactive role for government in nurturing development, and Fang Gan, one of China's most prominent reform advocates. How do we understand political reform during the 40 years of reform and opening up, and how do you assess the relationship between political reform and economic reform?
The essence of this question is how to examine the CPC leadership. What's the meaning of reform? It's definitely about much more than economic and governance reform. It's highly inclusive, comprehensive, and society-wide, covering all spheres: economics, politics, culture, institutions, and so on. Some claim that China doesn't seem to have experienced any reform of its political institutions, but only the economic. Personally, I think this is a grave misunderstanding of the reality. In my opinion, ever since China launched its reform and opening up process in 1978, 1979, and 1980, political restructuring was always elevated to a very important position. In fact, it was the starting point of all reform. Without restructuring our political institutions, there would be no reform at all. And it's been a really long process ever since.
I clearly believe that the political reforms were important for China. And take China, let's go back to 1978, where the Deng Xiaoping says, let's open up, let's use more of the market economy. But at the same time, the whole institutional environment is not suited. It's not suited for a market economy. And I think there's been political reforms inside the party and as part of the 1982 constitutional reforms that were important to stabilize the political environment, for people to make the political environment more predictable. But I think the crucial reform was indeed decentralization of authority. Decentralization of authority to local government leaders, and then within a very broad plan of reforms, and then with very clear incentive mechanisms for those local government officials.
How economic reform and economic necessity has caused governance reform in China, because political reform, governance reform is a big issue, and how has the impetus of economic necessity affected the whole process of governance in China?
I think in past 40 years, a lot of things are already changed. because of change of economic situation. Government have, well, first of all, the market is now so big. Government cannot control everything. You have to give up a lot of control on the things, and you have to develop the private sector, and you have to have a sector of foreign investment. So in dealing with those new sectors, you need to have different governance.
The argument on the other side is that because of the nature of the Chinese system and the strength of the Chinese government in relationship to the country, which has always been the case in Chinese history but continues to be the case, that the government needs more dials to turn, more things to control in the economy, so that if things happen like an Asian financial crisis or some perturbation, that the government can quickly make changes. In order to assure the safety of the totality of the society, the government still needs those dials uniquely in China. You've heard that argument.
Yeah, of course. In some sense, yes. If you are not very sophisticated to, you know, for example, to mobilize the resources from all the private sectors. So you need something under direct control of yourself.
Yeah, right.
So that's a way to think about it. Yeah. If you're more sophisticated, you don't need to direct control. You can mobilize resources by different ways, you know, like other countries' government normally do.
But the argument is that in China, that won't work as well, and it's too dangerous.
Yeah, well, in China, it's not too dangerous, but in China's way, it may be more efficient, more effective, because it's quick. You know, you don't need to approved by the Congress, for example. Right. You just do it, you know, because it's under your own control and your own money. So that's a direct movement. It could be quicker and could you know, to deal with those kind of risks.
What I believe is that capable governments, such as the one in China, can take on a bigger role than less capable governments. And that means a more active role also in steering the economy and regulating the economy. And I think that there are issues of productivity and productivity differences and competition and innovation that make one conclude, if you just were to think about increasing per capita income over time, you would see a shrinking role of state ownership in the economy. It doesn't mean a shrinking role of the state, because there's many more instruments that the state can use to help steer the economy, and that is regulation, it's taxation, it's subsidies.
Do you see a transformation in terms of the relationship between government and market in China as you're managing this process?
I think that requires new theories, and that a new theory I try to promote. I call new structural economics. I think that the economic development or economic operations always requires both government and the market. But how to demark their function? I do have a formula for that. The efficient market enabling state is the precondition of efficient markets. But the goal of enabling state is to have efficient market. So one is a precondition, but one is the aim of the government.
Right. Yeah. How close is China to that now?
I think it's just like an endless pursuit. Yeah, you need to balance, because...
And you never quite get there, but
you can never get there.
It's Zeno's paradox. You get closer and closer to the wall.
Because the market values will, you know, demonstrate itself in different areas at different stages of development.
What's best today and to get there, and then what's best ultimately?
Yeah. Well, different people have different opinion on what is
that's what I want to hear.
The optimism. But I will argue, you can think this way. There's two groups. One is emphasize more on the market role. One is emphasize more on the government role, and it's all reflected in the government document you mentioned. And but you can see the balance is moving to the state, to the market. Even this leadership And when they first come, they come up with the word of market plays a major role. But then the new documents say the market plays a decisive role. So this is a moving toward, the moving toward the more market roles. However, I would like to remind you, this is the issue, not for China its own. It's an issue for every country. You know, even U.S. different style, different way, but it's always the Republicans and the Democrats, they have different views on the government, social security, all those things, poor and the rich, and all those issues. So for China, plus China have an issue of history. We come out from planned economy. We come out from the 2,000 years of history of a centralized system. So definitely it's an issue. It's not only the issue today, but it will be the issue tomorrow as well.
The concept of marketization is the key one in this transformation from planned to a market economy. And as we're now going into the next period of time after the 40 years, this new era, Xinshidai, what are the areas of marketization that still needs to be evaluated and still needs to be deepened?
一方面，我们要按照
On the one hand, in order to improve the quality and efficiency of economic growth, we should focus on solving problems and proceed properly with supply-side structural reform. Then, from the results-oriented perspective, what problems should be addressed to build a better developed, more comprehensive socialist market economy? The key is to prioritize two crucial elements, the property rights system and the market-based allocation of resources. Actually, the property rights system comprises the basic economic system of China's entire socialist market economy. It's at the core of our ownership system. Meanwhile, the market-based allocation of resources reflects the market's efficiency. Only by combining these two factors can we establish a stable, highly efficient socialist market economy. So this is the major challenge that confronts us today.
Rule of law is not a concept that is rooted deeply in Chinese culture. It has been 20 years since China first proposed rule of law. It was in 1997, at its 15th National Congress, that China's ruling party, the CPC, for the first time in its history, elevated rule of law to the high level of national strategy, making it clear that the mission and tasks of governance reform are building a socialist country with rule of law. On September 20th, 1954, the First National People's Congress passed China's first constitution, with all 1,197 members voting in favor. During the first 30 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China's rule of law was hindered, especially by the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. The reform and opening up policy, which began in 1978, gave China opportunity to correct its past mistakes.
To safeguard democracy, we must enhance rule of law. We must strive for institutionalized and legalized democracy so that the system and laws will stay the same, even if China's leaders changes over time, or the focus or views of China's leaders changes.
In 1982, China adopted a new constitution that is still in use today. Since then, China began to enhance the rule of law. 3 decades later, in 2011, China's National People's Congress announced the formulation of a socialist legal system with Chinese characteristics. As of 2017, the National People's Congress had adopted some 258 pieces of legislation, regulating nearly every aspect of national life. But why don't you characterize the difference between rule by law and rule of law, and characterize the difference between rule by man and rule by law, and then rule of law?
Well, ultimately, a rule by law system can be reduced to rule of man. Rule of law means everyone is equal before a set of law. No one is outside that law, and no one is there just to use law as an instrument to serve his or her purpose everyone is equal before the law. Now, this is very critical because if you are going to run a market system, you have to take the property rights very seriously, and you have to take individual freedom very seriously, and to make that happen, a rule of law system is very critical. In essence, let me put it very simply. A system based on rule of law means you have to protect private rights and to restrict public rights. Rule by law is the opposite. You expand the scope of public rights, and you reduce the scope of private rights.
It seems that in recent years, under President Xi Jinping, that the rule of law, I mean, there's been more emphasis on it, more emphasis on judicial reform and on taking the powers away from local officials and county or municipal party secretaries and moving it up to province level or Supreme Court. It seems to be efforts to reform the system and rule of law. How significant and how important is that for the continuing economic development?
We have been talking about the critical importance of the market, but the market cannot operate smoothly in and of itself. The rule of law has to be there. In other words, the rule of law system and the market are just the two sides of the same coin for the market to operate smoothly. People often emphasize the role of the market without talking about rule of law. But if you do serious research globally, robust rule of law, modern market, plus innovative ideas, that are the ultimate principal causes for prosperity. And it's very compelling. The data is so compelling. The other important factor we tend not to talk so much is the vectors. The concept of vectors has two dimensions. One is the direction has to be correct. The other is the pace, the magnitude you have to measure, so that the pace, the measures you use is sensitive to local conditions. So two things. The direction has to be correct, but measured policies to make that happen.
But what kind of institutions do you need to support the process?
We have to clarify the conceptual differences first, and that has much to do with the education here in China. We at least need the elites to see the difference. Then gradually we need to set up the institutional arrangements. We need to have a higher degree of autonomy of the judiciary system. I say higher, not absolute degree. In reality, nothing is absolute. If you sort of compare and idealize the case with the reality, the direction, the vector, should move in that higher degree of autonomy, so that the court system will be less partial.
One cannot understand contemporary China without understanding the CPC. And one cannot understand governance reform in China without understanding reform in the CPC. To find out more about the party's role in the reform process, I speak with Huang Gang, director of the Center for China Study at Tsinghua University, and Li Zhenru, former vice president of the Central Party School, the highest educational institution that trains CPC officials. What's been the progress of governance reform during this period of time? And then, current time, as you look forward, what are some of the issues going forward?
We can illustrate this relationship geometrically. Within the umbrella of party leadership is a triangle of its overarching authority over three main sectors: the government, including the legislature, the market, including both state-owned and private enterprises, and society, including social organizations and communities. The three corners of this triangle are well connected to the legal system, as well as to the virtues of our Chinese characteristics. So, what's the difference between our system and that of Western countries? Beyond the governance of power, we also have governance of the market and society, with the party at its core. The ruling party must not only exert its authority, but also lead the market and society. This explains our national prism-shaped system. It's quite interesting, as the system of governance features what we call democratic centralism. At the third plenary session of the CPC's 18th Central Committee, Xi Jinping also offered his interpretation of our governance system. The entire system encompasses economics, politics, culture, society, and ecology, with all of it under the party's leadership.
Well, that is an excellent definition of what comprehensive reform means in the new era, to empower as many people, the whole country, as possible, to energize them to do as best as they can. So looking at what prevents that, what are the obstacles, everybody talks, and you reference, so-called interest groups.
We must deepen reform comprehensively, improve our socialist system with Chinese characteristics, and further modernize our governance system and capability. That's our overall goal. On the way to achieving this, we realize we can overcome many problems if we design an effective system, reform party institutions, and change the attitudes of our civil servants toward governance itself. As we carry on with reform, we may encounter many difficulties and setbacks. Primarily, the fact that many institutions and civil servants are stakeholders themselves, yet they view reform as a process that will deprive them of their former rights. Therefore, we must address this challenge.
What's the expression of socialism with Chinese characteristics? I assume the primary thing is the leadership of the party and the party's leadership of all aspects of the country. So how did that help, and are there any other expressions of socialism with Chinese characteristics other than the leadership of the party?
Actually, three major components comprise our modern-day socialism with Chinese characteristics. The first is the modernization itself. Reform and opening up must be in line with global trends in industrialization, urbanization, information development, and modernization. In this sense, we must catch up to our Western peers and counterparts. The second component, socialism. It's the essential political path which we must follow. That is, we shall not simply copy and paste the Western model for modernization. Rather, we must try to come up with a new innovative way to address the wealth gap, which the Western world has failed to address. We must achieve common prosperity. However, of course, successfully achieving this remains a fairly long process. The third component, Chinese characteristics. These reflect the essence of our culture. For instance, many foreigners find it difficult to understand the concept we call Shaokang society. It actually refers to the status as we evolve from a lower middle-income country to upper middle-income country. Therefore, many of our modernization expressions and concepts are actually rooted in our unique Chinese culture.
Governance reform in China is a broad concept. Economic reform could not have worked without governance reform. The overarching goal of governance reform is to make government more effective and more efficient. For over 20 years, the Chinese government has been becoming more of a regulator and less of a decider. And now that the market can play a decisive role, the transition is accelerating. In China's socialist system, how to balance market and government has been a perennial issue. Better, I believe, is how to optimize. What is optimum is often what is balanced, but not always. No one can doubt that rule of law is being strengthened in today's China, although issues remain, such as whether occasional interventions to achieve the so-claimed higher good of rule of virtue should ever supersede rule of law, and if it should, who makes that judgment? As for the CPC's role in governance, the trajectory has not been linear. Initially, the trend was toward more separation between party and government. Recently, toward the party's more active leadership of government. The challenge here is a natural tension between efficiency and productivity on the one hand and checks and balances on the other. China says proper governance reform is progressive, not radical, adaptive, not doctrinaire, rational, not intuitive, and orderly, not chaotic. Governance reform in China is a work in process. In the next episode, we explore social reform with its subtle and sustained pressures. We must to keep closer to China.